Chapter 19. Josh was awoken by his churning stomach. He didn't remember falling asleep, but he had apparently been out for a while. It was completely dark outside, so much so that he couldn't see more than a few feet outside the window. His stomach cramped again, and he quickly got off the mattress and headed into the bathroom. He barely managed to kneel down next to the toilet before he retched. He kept throwing up over and over again, more than he ever had in his life. Just when he thought that he might black out from the effort, his stomach heaved one more time, and a large object was thrown from his throat and into the bowl. He fell back against the bathroom wall, so tired from the exertion that he couldn't even raise his arm to wipe his mouth. He could hear himself panting as he closed his eyes and tried to concentrate on breathing. Even as he sat there, however, he could feel that something had changed. It felt like a great pressure had been relieved. His weary mind searched for the right word. It felt like he had been cleansed. It could have been minutes or even hours before he felt ready to try standing up. He winced as he used the small sink to lift himself. His body felt like it had been punched repeatedly. He managed to make it into the bedroom and collected the lamp. Going back into the bathroom, he carefully lowered himself back down onto his knees and held the light out over the toilet. The object that his body had expelled was down at the bottom, and he leaned closer to get a better look while trying to ignore the smell. He quickly backed off. His mind couldn't quite put together what it was that he was seeing. It was a mass of tentacles and teeth and so many other things that he didn't have names for, all surrounded by coagulated blood. At one end was a face, one so closely resembling a human that his mind reeled away from the implications. Without hesitation, he flushed the toilet, then flushed it again, and finally flushed it a third time. Only then did he look back into the bowl. The thing was gone, leaving only water. For the first time since he had arrived at the beach house, his mind felt clear. There was no pain, and his thoughts were sharper. He hadn't even realized how out of it he had been. Now that the haze was gone, though, he immediately recognized the difference. He looked back down at the toilet. That thing had been inside of him. Had it been in his head? He shuddered in revulsion at the thought. Not knowing what else to do, he laid back down on the mattress. His body throbbed like a sore tooth from all of the throwing up. He closed his eyes and quickly fell back asleep. There was no way of knowing how long he slept. When he woke up, there was a light streaming through the section of windows that peeked out from above the overturned bed. He was still a bit sore, but he was feeling much better than he had the previous night. He went into the bathroom and splashed some water from the tub over his face. He hesitated briefly before using his hands to drink from the water. There was a part of him that was wary of drinking from a source that he couldn't fully trust, but he reminded himself that he had to have water, and there wasn't anything he could do about it if it was somehow tainted. The lantern had run out of oil, and it sat cold and dark next to the mattress. He put it onto the nightstand and put his shoes on so that he could move the dresser out of the way of the door. Before opening it, he put his ear up against it and listened intently. He couldn't hear anything, so he slowly opened the door and went out into the kitchen. Everything was just how he had left it, right down to the open cabinets. He went outside and stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps to look around. There were strange prints in the sand, indentations that looked somewhat like bare feet, but not quite. He examined one of the prints closer. It almost looked like the toes were attached to one another, like the webbing of a duck's feet. Whatever had made the prints was nowhere to be seen. He watched the waves crash against the shore for a few moments before going back inside. The longer he was here, the more he was realizing that nothing was as it should be. He quickly turned as he heard a sound from behind him. His surprise turned to disbelief as he watched the door that he originally entered the house from swing open into the living room. That disbelief became anger as he watched Sylvia Curioso step inside. "I have to admit, I'm a little disappointed," the woman said as she smiled at him. Josh took a step forward, his hands balling into fists. She tilted her head slightly and pointed a finger at him. His body froze. No matter how much he tried to struggle, he couldn't move. Now, none of that, she said. I get why you would be a little peeved at me, a bit perturbed, if you will. That doesn't matter, though. What does matter is that your body has rejected the demonic implantation process. I guess that I shouldn't be surprised. It's a lot more effective in young children, but I thought that maybe with your family history, well, whatever. She came into the kitchen and flipped the long side of her hair over her shoulder. She slowly walked around him, moving her eyes up and down his body as she went. She came to a stop directly in front of him and shook her head. Oh, you could have been great as one of the troupe, she continued. There's definitely something dark inside of you. You're going to be incredible when it gets to come out and play. Curioso went back to the door. Well, no use crying over the proverbial spilled milk, I suppose. I'd better get you back to your friend before she starts to get really worried. The last thing that I need is a Dyer snooping around before everything is in place. She snapped her fingers, and he began to walk towards the door. He wasn't in control of his own body, and it was a horrifying experience. She seemed to understand what he was thinking, and her grin grew broader and more sinister. That's right, puppet boy, she taunted. March. You're really going to let me go? Josh asked, surprised that he could speak. Only because it solves a potential problem before it can become one. Besides, it's not like you remember any of this anyway. She reached out and gripped him by the shoulder. She quickly kissed him on the cheek, opened the door, and pushed him through. He tumbled through onto the porch of the old house in Maestru and Liber's Carnival of Wonders and Horrors, and the door closed behind him. Josh looked around slowly as music blared from the speakers and the crowd passed by where he was standing. He closed his eyes for a moment before reopening them. He couldn't remember the exact details of how he had got into this part of the carnival. He remembered speaking to Curioso. She had very nicely offered to take him somewhere to get help for his headache. It took him a moment to realize that he was holding something in his hand. He opened it to find that it was a pair of aspirin tablets. She must have brought him here and gotten him the painkillers. The headache was gone now, though, so he slipped the aspirin into his pocket just in case he needed them later. Something on the ground caught his attention. He leaned over and retrieved a dirty piece of paper. It felt flimsier to the touch than a normal sheet of paper, and there were a number of discolored spots on it. He turned it over to find a short message written in what looked like dried blood. Trapped in the house. Need help. Josh Taylor. He looked at it in confusion. It was in his handwriting and had his name on it. He glanced back at the building behind him. Trapped in the house. He had never even been in the house. Maybe this was some sort of carnival trick like the tent covered in wax had been. He carefully folded up the piece of paper and put it into his wallet for safekeeping. It was probably another oddity in Lamplight Woods' long list of oddities. He looked back up just in time to see Sarah coming towards him, a mixture of happiness and apprehension on her face. Chapter 20. Sarah wasn't exactly sure what to say as she approached Josh. This was a first for her. Ever since they had met, they had both been comfortable speaking their minds to one another without fear of repercussions. Tonight had been their first argument, however, and she wasn't sure how that had changed their dynamic. She hoped that something hadn't been permanently damaged. He watched her as she drew closer. Something was off about him, though. He seemed like he was in a daze, or maybe that he was just coming out of one. He also looked completely exhausted. There were bags under his eyes, and he was hunched over slightly. Hey, she said simply as she came to a stop a few feet away from him. Hey, he replied, giving her a small smile. I'm going to... Jenni said awkwardly as she pointed off in another direction, Yeah, just going to go anywhere else but here. She waved as she headed back in the direction of the carnival entrance. Sarah turned her attention back to the matter at hand. Now that she was closer to him, she could see that he looked even more tired than she had thought. She was about to ask him what happened when he started speaking. Listen, about earlier, he began slowly. I was being a dick. I don't know what I was thinking. It was like, no, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that I fucked up, and I'm sorry. It's okay, Sarah said as she smiled at him. No, it's not. He looked away from her. You were just trying to help. You're the last person I'd want to hurt, but obviously I did. Hey, stop. She took his hand and squeezed it. It's okay, Josh. It really is. Let's just forget about it and move on. You're sure? I can keep groveling. It's really not a problem. She laughed, and things were right once again between them. Maybe later when I'm wearing my groveling shoes. Want to go check out some of the rides? Absolutely. They slowly walked in the general direction of the Ferris wheel. Sarah felt herself fully relaxing for the first time since their argument. It had been a small one in the grand scheme of things, but it had still worried her. She was also still holding his hand. She felt a goofy smile starting, and she immediately suppressed it. Holding hands didn't mean anything. They were friends. Friends were allowed to hold hands. He adjusted his hand slightly and laced his fingers with hers. The smile threatened once again, and this time she had to turn her head away from him to let it pass its course. She admonished herself for acting like some schoolgirl with a crush. They were friends. Friends held hands. Sometimes. Once the smile had faded, she turned her attention back to him. He seemed relaxed and happy, but once again she was struck by just how exhausted he looked. Hey, are you okay? She asked. Yeah, Josh replied with a nod. Why? You just look so tired. I feel tired. If I'm being honest, I kind of feel like I got run over by a truck. I had a pretty bad headache earlier. It must have drained me more than I thought. At the risk of sounding like I'm mothering you again, do you want to leave? He paused. I don't know. Let's do a few things and see how I'm feeling. Maybe I just need to get my second wind. Sounds like a plan. So do you want to do something slow and steady to see if that second wind kicks in? Or do you want to try something a bit more high impact to try and make it kick in? He smiled. It's pretty obvious which option you're hoping that I go for. I might have a slight preference, yes. Then lead the way. Sarah changed their direction slightly so that they were headed towards one of the rides she had seen earlier. It was in the shape of a large wheel, but it started on the ground and rose up as the car spun around it. She hadn't ridden that type of ride before, and she was looking forward to it. A Curian, Josh said as they got into line. Pardon? She asked. A Curian. That's what the sign says that the ride is called. Interesting name. There was a loud screech. Sarah winced as it echoed throughout the carnival before quickly fading. It had come from the speakers scattered throughout the area. Good evening, carnival goers, a man's voice said happily over the same speakers. We hope that you're having an absolutely fantastic time this evening. The time is now 9 o'clock. At 10, the carnival will be closed to everyone under the age of 13. I didn't realize it was that late already, Josh said. We apologize for any inconvenience, the voice continued. From 10 until dawn, however, that's when the real fun happens for the older ones among us. Frights and delights all night, courtesy of Maestru and Liber's Carnival of Wonders and Horrors. The speakers clicked off. The crowd had stopped moving and fallen silent during the announcement, but now there was a buzz going through it. Sarah couldn't help but feel excited herself. What do you suppose is going to happen? She asked. I have no idea, Josh replied. There was something in the way that he spoke that sounded a little off. She studied his face as he was distracted with the crowd. He had sounded nervous. "Do you want to hang around to find out?" she asked, trying to make it sound like a casual question. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do. I very much want to know what will happen." They reached the front of the line and were directed towards one of the cars attached to the wheel. Sarah was surprised to find that the seats weren't side by side. Instead, there was one long seat, meaning that one person would need to sit against the back, and the other would sit up against that person. I can get a separate car," Josh said as he saw the situation. "There's a pretty good-sized line behind us," Sarah pointed out. "We can share one. You know, so that the line can move more." "Right. Good thinking. The line." He almost slipped as he got into the car. It wobbled on the metal tether that connected it to the wheel, and he clearly hadn't been expecting it to move when he put his foot inside. He smiled sheepishly before carefully getting in all the way and pushing himself back as far as he could. She was almost shaking as she got in after him, being careful not to step on his extended legs. There wasn't any sort of lower area in the car, so he had been forced to stretch them out forward. She sat down between them and gripped the metal sidebar as the ride operator slid the door closed. "I've never seen a ride set up like this before," Josh said. "Same," Sarah agreed as she glanced over her shoulder at him. "I'm not sitting too close, am I?" "No," he answered quickly. "No, you're fine. I think... Never mind, maybe not." "What were you going to say?" She couldn't be sure, but she thought that she saw him swallow hard. "It's just... with as fast as the ride was going when we were in line, I think that if you don't sit all the way back, you're going to get thrown around." "Oh." She felt her face growing warm. "Would that be okay? Sitting back, I mean?" "Yeah, of course. Sure." Being as careful as she could, Sarah slid back on the seat as far as she could until she was pressed up against him. She leaned back slightly to rest her back on his chest. He was warm, and she had to admit that he was surprisingly comfortable to lay against. At first he was tense, but after a few moments she felt him relax. "The ride's starting," Josh said as the car began to slowly move forward. "Yes," Sarah agreed with a small smile. "I think it is." Chapter 21. Jenni slowly wandered around the carnival with her hands in her pockets. She smiled slightly as she idly watched a group of children gathered around a set of skee-ball ramps. It had been obvious from the exact second that Sarah had spotted Josh that things were going to be fine, and that her presence was no longer required. She had made it a point to exit stage left as quickly as possible. Now, though, she found herself trying to figure out what to do. She had called Maggie to see how much longer she was going to be, but her wife had informed her that she needed to drive one of the fighting teenagers she had been dealing with home. Until she got back, Jenni didn't want to ride any more rides so that they could experience them together. She had already cheated by riding Ex Oblivion, but what Maggie didn't know wouldn't hurt her. Besides, it had been for a good cause. Currently, though, she was left to fend for herself. The urge to return to the food vendors was high, but she managed to restrain herself. There was already a good chance that she would be sick in the morning. The combination of things she had already consumed was going to make for something unpleasant. It had been worth it, though. She felt a buzzing in her pocket. She retrieved her phone and checked it. It was a text message from Maggie. "Finished up with the kid," it read. "Going to try to convince Michael to come to the carnival." "Good," she texted back. "Get him out of that house and over here." She put her phone away and shook her head slightly. Maggie was worried about Michael, and frankly, so was she. For the last couple of months he had left Forgotten Tales as little as possible. He said it was because he was getting the store ready for its reopening. Jenni was sure that there was more to it than that. While he was certainly busy with the store, he had seemed distant and distracted whenever they had managed to get him away from it. His eyes had a touch of sadness in them more often than not. Without realizing it, She had returned to the front part of the carnival where the individual exhibits and attractions were housed in tents. The crowd was thinner now than it had been previously, since there had been time for people to spread out. She read the signs posted outside the tents as she walked, looking for something that sounded interesting. One of the signs caught her attention. Instead of just being handwritten like many of them, this one's lettering was burned into wood. She leaned in closer to get a better look. House of the Ice Queen, the sign read. She had to admit that sounded intriguing. The tent flap was closed. Not sure if the exhibit was actually open, she tapped her knuckles against it like she was knocking on a door. A woman's voice from inside told her to come in. She pushed the flap aside and entered. It was freezing inside. Jenni immediately crossed her arms over her chest and shivered. While it was around 60 degrees outside the tent, inside it felt like a walk-in freezer. Frost had formed all along the tent, and she could see her breath in the air. In the center of the tent was a large block of ice sitting on a platform. It was around 6 feet long, and it had been shaped into an almost coffin-like shape. Floating in the center of the ice was a woman dressed in a long blue dress with wavy blonde hair. As Jenni watched, the woman turned her head to look at her. It shouldn't have been possible. If she was frozen that solid, not only could she not have moved, she shouldn't even be alive. It was clearly some kind of illusion. I know what you're thinking, the woman said with a small smile. Right now you're thinking that you can't be seeing what you're seeing. The woman sat up. Her body went through the top of the ice without breaking through. She was just sitting up with the undisturbed top of the block around her. With another smile, she stepped out of the ice and placed her bare feet on the cold floor before standing all the way up. Go on, the woman prompted. Take a look. Jenni slowly approached the ice and looked closely at it. No matter how hard she looked, however, she couldn't see anything out of the ordinary about it. It appeared to be a solid block of ice. Touch it, the woman said. She took her hand out from underneath her armpit and hesitantly ran her fingers along the block. It was definitely ice. She slowly went around the block and examined every inch of it that she could see. When she had finished, she looked up and slowly shook her head. There's a trick to it, of course, the woman said, coming around the ice to stand next to her. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I don't want you to think that you're going crazy. It's an impressive trick, Jenni said. I've never seen anything like it. Well, that's the point, isn't it? It wouldn't be any fun if it wasn't unique. I've got a few more of them up my sleeve, if you would like to see them. My name is Lisbeth Erickson, by the way. Jenni Grant. The sign outside calls you the Ice Queen. Yes, a bit dramatic for my taste, but that doesn't make the sign wrong. Erickson held out her hand and blew on it. The breath froze over her palm, creating a highly detailed bird made out of ice. Jenni leaned in closer and marveled at how real it looked. The Ice Queen suddenly threw the bird up into the air. As Jenni watched in amazement, it came to life and spread its wings. It flew around the tent twice before returning to Erickson's hand and going back to its original unmoving state. That's incredible, Jenni marveled. Is it? Erickson asked with an arched eyebrow. Can a simple trick be considered incredible? Even if it is real, it was just a bird. Birds aren't complex creatures. A bit of seed, a trill of song, and they're in the palm of your hand. The woman handed her the ice bird. Jenni slowly took it from her and held it in both hands. Her eyes widened. She could feel a heartbeat coming from the bird's chest. Jenni Grant, Erickson said, putting a particular emphasis on her last name. You're the wife of Lamplight Woods' sheriff, aren't you? Yes, Jenni replied slowly, setting the bird down on the large block of ice. Why do you ask? The woman shrugged. Not for any sinister reason, I assure you. Miss Curioso happened to mention that you met her earlier this evening. She made it very clear that you're an honored guest here. That's nice of her. Feeling a bit uncomfortable, Jenni started back towards the entrance of the tent. "Thank you for showing me your amazing talents, Miss Erickson." Erickson reached out and put her fingers on Jenni's arm. Her touch was cold, so cold that it immediately brought goosebumps. She stepped closer. "I have one last trick to show you," she said quietly. "I'm afraid that I wasn't quite being truthful when I said my reasons weren't sinister." Chapter 22. Maggie pulled into the driveway and turned off the car. It had taken far longer than it should have, but the situation with the two fighting teens at the carnival had finally been dealt with. While she could have simply left them to members of the carnival security team, she decided to handle things herself. She knew both of the boys involved, and they were both decent enough kids, so she had stepped in to make sure that charges weren't filed. She smiled tightly. They probably wished they had been taken to jail for the talk she had given them. It hadn't involved talking so much as it involved shouting, and she could have a very piercing voice when she wanted to. She had used it to its fullest effect. Her smile broadened. Things were going to be especially rough for one of the boys, Chris Tanner. His parents hadn't answered when she had tried to call them, so she had driven him home. It turned out that they had been in the middle of a rather vigorous session of lovemaking. They hadn't been very happy when the local sheriff had shown up on their doorstep with their son. She got out of the car and walked up to the front door of Forgotten Tales. She knocked on the door and waited for a few minutes, but there was no response. She tried again and got the same result. Frowning, she went around the side of the house. Michael's car was in the driveway with Josh Taylor's car pulled in behind it, so he was still home. She continued along the gravel driveway until she reached the back of the house. She found Michael lying in the grass in the backyard. He was staring up at the sky, one arm under his head and the other over his stomach. There was a can of soda sitting next to him. A few feet away, Mira was curled up in a blue ball. "Mind if I join you?" she asked as she walked across the grass towards him. "Pull up some grass," he replied without looking at her. She carefully took off her duty belt and set it down on the back porch. With that done, she sat on the grass next to him with a grunt and laid back. She whistled. "That is one hell of a view," she said as she admired the clear night sky. "I bet you didn't get anything like this in San Diego." "Nope," Michael agreed. It wasn't as bad as some of the larger California cities, but there was still a lot of pollution and lights that blocked out the sky. The price you pay for living in the city instead of the country, I suppose. There were some perks, though. "Yeah, like what?" "Excellent Chinese food at 2 in the morning, for starters." "I'd kill for good Chinese food at any time of the day here. The only place to get it is 2 towns over." "Oh, believe me, I know. One of the first things that I did when I got back to Lamplight Woods was check to see if a place had opened while I was gone. You can imagine my disappointment." "I bet." They were silent for a while. Maggie tried to remember the last time that she had the luxury of just laying in some grass and watching the sky. As a child, she had often spent summer afternoons doing that, watching the clouds pass by and trying to figure out what they looked like before inevitably being lulled to sleep. She was surprised to find just how much she missed those days. "You're probably wondering what I'm doing out here," Michael said, his voice hushed as if he didn't want to break the peacefulness. "I'm a little curious," she admitted. "Evelyn and I used to do this as teenagers. My dad would usually be drunk and passed out by 9, so we'd come out here and just look up at the stars and talk. Actually, that's not true. It didn't matter if we could see the stars or not. I remember lying next to her here during a rainstorm and laughing our heads off." Maggie smiled. "That sounds fun." It was. Those are some of my favorite memories. I looked out the kitchen window as I was cleaning up tonight and saw the stars, and the next thing I knew I was out here and on the ground. Her smile faded. "You've been thinking about Evelyn a lot lately, haven't you?" He shrugged. "I'm always thinking about her." "Yeah, but you've been preoccupied over the past few weeks, and don't try to tell me that it's because of the store." Michael sighed. I guess I have had Evie on my mind more than usual. Part of it is being back in Lamplight Woods. There's a lot of things here that remind me of her. Maggie turned on her side so that she was facing him. And the other part? That would be Sarah. He sat up on his elbows. Something's changed in her this summer. She's more sure of herself, and she has this drive that I've never seen in her before. Add that to the fact that she looks a lot like her mother, and there's basically a second Evelyn running around. She hesitated. Michael, I'm saying this as your friend. I think you need to try to move on. She braced for what she assumed would be an angry retort. To her surprise, he rubbed at his eyes and nodded. It's not for lack of trying, he told her. I know it's not healthy to hold on to her memory and let it affect me like it does. It's not fair to Sarah either. I am trying, and believe it or not, I feel like I'm making some progress. Then what is this about? She asked, waving her hand vaguely at the lawn. He thought about it. I don't know. Want my opinion on it? He snorted. You're going to give it to me whether I do or not. I think you're lonely. Come to the carnival and hang out with Jenni and me. It will be fun. This isn't a request, by the way. He sighed. Well, if that's the case, let me go inside and get my wallet. They got up from the ground and he went inside. Mira started to rub up against Maggie's leg, and she bent down to pet the animal. As was always the case, she felt static on her fingertips as she did so. It was a strange but not entirely unpleasant sensation. Michael came back out and locked the door behind him. Together they walked down the driveway towards her car. She nodded to herself in satisfaction. A night out with friends was just what he needed. As they came around the side of the house, they halted. Two figures were standing on the front lawn. One of the figures was roughly the same height as Michael, but the other was huge. It was at least 7 feet tall, and it was built like a tank. A van was parked in the street behind them, its lights pointed at the house and casting them both in silhouette. The smaller of the two stepped forward. Good evening, Mr. Dyer, Leonard Liber said with a nod of his head. My associate and I were wondering if we could have a moment of your time. Chapter 23. At 15 minutes before 10, an announcement had been made over the speaker system that it was time for all children under the age of 13, and those that didn't wish to participate in the carnival's night activities, to leave the grounds. Sarah and Josh had watched as families had headed towards the front gate, greatly thinning out the crowd. The person who made the announcement had also invited everyone that was staying together at the stage near the Ferris wheel, so they had made their way over to that part of the carnival to wait. I have to admit, this is kind of exciting, Sarah said as they found a spot back away from the majority of the people. I'm feeling a combination of excited and nervous, Josh replied. Why are you nervous? He shook his head. I don't know. I just am. I can't seem to shake it. A large post clock had been placed next to the stage. It was black with gold accents. The post was tall enough that it towered over the crowd. She watched as the arrow-shaped minute hand moved one tick closer to 12. Well, it won't be long before we find out if your instincts are right, she said. There's only a couple of minutes left until 10. She looked over at him when he didn't answer. He was staring off into the distance at something. She followed his line of sight and saw that it was the building that she had found him standing outside of. Everything okay? She asked. He said as he blinked and turned back towards her. Oh, yeah, everything's fine. That building over there, the one that looks like an old house? That would be a weird place for a first aid station, right? I'd say so. I can almost feel the tetanus from here. Why? He shook his head and smiled. Never mind. It was a dumb question. I don't mind dumb questions. In fact, there's a rumor going around that I asked one once, but personally, I think that's just crazy talk. 1 minute left. The tone of the crowd changed as the final countdown began. The noise level dropped, and everyone watched the clock expectantly. Sarah was reminded of watching the final moments before a new year in Times Square on television. "Here we go," Josh muttered as the final 5 seconds ticked away. The clock struck 10. At the exact moment the minute hand reached 12, all the lights in the carnival shut off. Sarah fought back a sudden sense of panic. She couldn't see anything, and she could feel the crowd begin to draw closer to where they were standing. Josh put his arm around her and turned his body slightly so that he was between her and the stage. The lights came back on. All of them glowed red, however, casting everything in shades of crimson. The sound of static, so quiet that she almost didn't notice it, played over the speakers. A woman was standing on the stage. She was wearing a mask that completely covered her face. It was blank, devoid of any features. There didn't even seem to be any holes for the person wearing it to see through. Even though her face was covered, the woman's odd hair immediately identified her as Sylvia Curioso. Sarah felt Josh's body clench. She looked up at him and saw that his eyes were locked on Curioso. He had an expression on his face that she didn't recognize. "Well now," Curioso said, her voice projecting through the nearby speakers via an unseen microphone. "Hello again, Lamplight Woods. I hope you're ready for the fun to really begin." The crowd cheered. "Oh, come on. You have to do better than that." The responding cheer was much louder than the first had been. "That's better," Curioso said approvingly. "Down to business, then. From now until the first traces of dawn, Maestru and Liber's Carnival of Wonders and Horrors is going to be transformed into a place where truly anything can happen. It will be a place where your deepest, darkest fantasies can be satisfied. It will be a place where your greatest fears will be given free rein. All you have to do is sit back and enjoy the ride. Can you folks do that?" There was another cheer. "Good. I thought that you could. Just remember, no matter what you see or experience, it's only a carnival." The lights went back out as she laughed. They were off for only a second before turning back on. Curioso had disappeared from the stage. The red glow was gone from the main lamps, but the lighting for the rides and tents was still blood red. The crowd quickly dispersed as everyone went off to see what new secrets the carnival held for them. The look and feel of the carnival had changed. People dressed in monstrous costumes were roaming around, scaring anyone that came close to them. The tents were solid colors instead of striped, and they alternated between red and black. The giant eye that Sarah had seen during the loop on Ex Oblivion was now visible from the ground. There were more subtle changes as well. Small tweaks to the lighting made the rides and exhibits feel like they were threatening instead of welcoming. The music playing from the speaker system was slightly distorted. Instead of welcoming smiles, many of the carnival employees were now sporting twisted grins. "I have a bad feeling about this," Josh muttered. Sarah nodded her head in agreement. There was something off about the carnival now, something that she couldn't put into words. No one else besides the two of them seemed to notice, however. Maybe there wasn't anything wrong. Maybe they were just being overly sensitive because of their previous encounters with the paranormal. 2 years prior, she had visited Universal Studios with her father during their annual Halloween event, and this wasn't that different. Maybe it was just the carnival's gimmick. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was indeed somehow different, though. "Do you want to stay?" she asked. "Do you?" Josh countered. "No, I really don't." "Neither do I. Let's get out of here." They headed back towards the exit. Sarah slipped her hand into Josh's and held it tightly. When she had done so earlier, it had been because she wanted to be close to him. Now it was because she wanted to make sure that they weren't separated. They passed by the building that she had found him outside of. She noticed that he watched it for a few moments with the same unreadable expression she had seen earlier. She was reminded of his odd question about it being a first aid station. Something was going on there, but she wasn't going to press him on it. He would bring it up if he wanted to talk about it. Reaching the end of the ride area, they entered the more narrow paths of the single-tent exhibits. Without discussing it, they went right down the path to the right. This put them on the opposite side of the main drag from the House of Ceromancy tent. All of the tent flaps were open now, revealing the exhibits inside. She glanced into the first one as they passed and saw a man sitting at a table. His arm was stretched out, and 2 people were taking turns inserting needles into his flesh. She shuddered and quickly looked away, making sure to keep her eyes forward and away from the tents. "This feels almost," she said, letting the sentence trail away as she searched for the right word. "Cruel," Josh finished for her in a disgusted voice. "Feels cruel." "Yeah, exactly." She couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched. Trying to be discreet, she casually looked over her shoulder. She couldn't be sure, but she thought that she saw a man wearing a ragged wolf mask staring at her from the crowd. The eyes were hollow and dead, and something dark stained the fur around the jaws. She turned her head forward and quickened her pace. After what seemed like hours, but had in reality only been minutes, the arch of the front gate came into view. There were barely any people there, and they practically ran towards it. Without looking back, they hurried past the now costumed staff at the gate and out of the carnival. They continued at their fast pace until they reached the bridge that led into town. They crossed it and came to a stop to catch their breath. Sarah turned back to face the carnival. Even from this distance, she could see the eye moving in the loop of the roller coaster. "Why do I feel like we just got really, really lucky?" she asked. Chapter 24. "We're not open," Michael said as he looked back and forth between the 2 men. "You were kind enough to let me shop earlier even though your store isn't officially open yet," Liber replied. "I was hoping that you would be as generous once again." "I take it we're not talking about another music box." "No, we are not." Michael glanced over at Maggie. She looked as confused as he was, but the fact that her hand was resting on her gun holster told him that she didn't like the situation either. He looked back at the 2 men standing in his front yard. "Why don't we just cut to the part where you tell me what you want?" he suggested with more confidence in his voice than he was feeling. "I would appreciate dispensing with the usual pleasantries," Liber said with a nod. "I have places to go and people to see tonight. It has come to my attention that you have a few things that I want." Michael's eyes narrowed. "You're going to have to be more specific than that. What are they?" "Oh, come now, Mr. Dyer. I'm sure that you don't recognize me, but I'm also quite sure that you recognize my companion." Michael clenched his teeth as he felt rage boiling up in him. He couldn't force it back down all the way, but he knew that if he let it overtake him, both he and Maggie would pay the price. "Tucker Bard," he replied, practically spitting out the name. "Bango the clown." "Must sting like a bitch to say my name out loud," the huge man said, stepping forward into the light coming from Forgotten Tales and revealing his clown makeup and outfit. It did. Bango was a part of the group led by Bingo, a sadistic haunted puppet that was currently trapped in the cells in the underground bunker beneath the backyard. There were a few malicious entities contained there, but Bingo was by far the worst. He was also the thing that had murdered Evelyn. Seeing Bingo's right-hand man standing just yards away was almost unbearable. Trying to keep control of himself, he turned towards Liber. "Let me guess," he said. "Your real name is Peter Hammond, right? Or do you prefer your name from the television show, Leo Lion?" "Well, now that's just impressive," the man replied with a small nod of acknowledgement. "Please, call me Leo. That is my true face." "What a serial killer way to put that," Maggie spoke up. Leo glanced at her for just a moment before turning his attention back to Michael. You have two things that we want, Mr. Dyer. Give us them both, and you just might live through the night. I have no idea what you're talking about, Michael said with a shrug. Oh, come on, don't insult me. We know about your little underground prison, and we know that you're holding our glorious leader there. No idea what you're talking about. Leo rolled his eyes. This isn't getting us anywhere. Bango, would you mind doing the honors and set Bingo free? I'm sure that he's growing impatient. The giant of a man took a step forward and cracked his neck. Out of the corner of his eye, Michael saw Maggie pull her gun out of the holster and point it at the giant. Her jaw was set, and her aim was steady. She moved so that she was standing slightly in front of him. Tell Jumbo to stand down, she growled. Put the gun down and step away, Sheriff, Leo ordered calmly. Your lovely wife Jenni is currently in the company of certain members of our carnival. I find making threats to be distasteful, but I'm sure that you understand your position. Maggie's arms wavered. She was visibly shaken, and no matter how much she was trying to remain calm and collected, it was obvious that she was losing that internal battle. Swearing violently, Michael reached out and gently lowered her gun. Fine, he spit out through clenched teeth. Take him. Maggie slammed her gun so hard into its holster that he was surprised the belt didn't snap. Her eyes were locked on Leo. Michael knew that if she had the chance, she would kill the man, but for the moment, they were powerless to do anything but comply with his demands. That's better, Leo said approvingly. Why don't the three of us wait here while Bango does what he does best? The clown headed around the side of the house towards the backyard. Michael ignored him and continued to watch Leo. There had to be some way out of this. He mentally ran through what he knew about the man. Peter Hammond had joined the Bingo Circus Extravaganza cast as Leo Lion, a mascot lion character that was mostly comic relief. Outside of the show, however, he was a sick and sadistic man that had murdered at least a dozen people, mostly young women. He had committed all of them while wearing his show costume. There had never been enough evidence for the authorities to prove that he was the killer, a common theme when it came to Bingo's troupe. His companion, Bango, was even worse. The man behind the makeup, Tucker Bard, was a former Vietnam War veteran that was rumored to have been discharged under mysterious circumstances. Michael didn't know how he had joined up with Bingo after that, but he had been the first to do so. Sometime after that, the giant man had turned cannibal. He didn't just kill people, he devoured them piece by piece. While we wait, Leo said suddenly, why don't we take care of the second order of business? Raising up his suit coat slightly, he reached back and pulled something out of the waistband of his pants. He gently, almost lovingly unfolded it. It was a lion mask, designed to cover the wearer's entire head. The rubber parts were cracked and faded, and large tufts of the hair were missing. Parts of it were covered in brownish stains. He carefully pulled the mask over his head and tucked the edges underneath his dress shirt. That's much better, he said, his voice sounding sinister as it came out through the mask. Now then, where's the key, Mr. Dyer? What key? Michael asked, genuinely confused by the odd question. The lodge key. We know that you have it. When demons had appeared not long after Michael and his daughter had returned to Lamplight Woods after an over decade and a half absence, he and Maggie had eventually found themselves in the home of the woman that had summoned them. There they had found a key attached to a green diamond-shaped keychain with the words Blackwood Lodge written on it. With as busy as he had been since then, he'd only had limited time to look into it. So far he hadn't come up with anything. Why do you want it? Maggie demanded. Michael glanced over at her. She could have quite the temper at times, but she was controlling herself remarkably well given the circumstances. Her eyes betrayed how difficult it was for her to do so. Doesn't matter? Leo answered with a snort. Or is the only thing that really matters the fact that we'll tear your wife to pieces if your friend here doesn't give us what we want? It's yours, Michael said quickly as he saw Maggie's jaw tighten. I'll go inside and get it. Oh, please, don't treat me like an idiot. We'll get it ourselves. Just tell me where it is. It had been worth a try. It's in the study. The study is hidden. You'll need to... No need to explain, a woman's voice said from behind him, so close that he could feel the speaker's breath on his neck. Both Michael and Maggie spun around in surprise. Standing a few feet away was a woman. She was wearing a long black dress, and her hair was cut oddly, with one side short and the other side long. Sylvia Curioso, Maggie spat out. Not Curioso, Michael corrected, feeling his mouth go dry. Her name is Poe. The final member of Bingo's inner circle, Sylvia Poe was by far the most dangerous of them. She possessed powers that very few understood, and even fewer knew where they came from. The term witch didn't even begin to scratch the surface. I'm flattered that you remember me, Poe said. It's been quite a while. Of course, I remember you as well, Mr. Dyer. I think about you quite often. He understood the threat underneath her words, and he shuddered. I'll go retrieve the key, Poe told Leo. You and Bango bring Bingo to me at the theater tent. I'll be ready by the time you've returned. Raising her eyebrow at Michael, she smiled slightly before going up the front steps and into Forgotten Tales. She shut the door behind her, and the lock engaged with an audible click. She had barely crossed the threshold when laughter echoed from out towards the backyard. Michael's body began to shake, but he refused to turn towards the sound. Instead, he kept his attention directly on Leo. He was determined not to give the man the satisfaction of seeing how angry and scared he was. Even over the laughing, he could hear the sound of Bango's huge feet crunching on the driveway gravel. They drew rapidly closer, and in less than a minute he heard the voice that had haunted him for so long. Mikey, the voice exclaimed. How nice of you to be here for my jailbreak. Michael threw one last searing look at Leo before he reluctantly turned towards the speaker. Sitting on Bango's broad shoulder was a black and white Siberian husky hand puppet. It was wearing a red coat with tails, and a top hat sat on its head. It was the host for the spirit of Walter Douglas, but both his real name and his humanity had been abandoned long ago. What? No hug? Bingo asked with feigned sadness. I thought we were friends. Go to hell, Michael replied shortly. Bingo threw back his head and laughed. That is a very appropriate request to make tonight, Mikey. Oh, I can't wait to see the expression on your face when you see the fun that I have planned. Speaking of which, do you have what I asked for, Leo? Indeed, Leo replied, looking up at his master. Poe is going to be waiting for us when we arrive. Having the right people to work with makes all the difference, right, Mikey? Well, I must be going. Don't worry, though. We'll play together very, very soon. The trio began walking towards the van, but after only a few steps, Bingo called a halt. You know what? He asked. I can't leave things like this. I want to give you something for the trouble of letting me stay here at your beautiful home. Put out your left hand. Michael didn't move. Come on, Mikey, don't be stubborn. Are you really going to make me say it? Okay, fine. If you don't put out your left hand right this second, I'll have Bango twist the head of your friend's wife off like the lid of a pickle jar. Not having a choice, Michael extended his arm and presented his hand palm down. Bingo examined it for a moment before he nodded to himself. Bango, please give Mr. Dyer our thanks, Bingo instructed. Bango leaned over with surprising speed. His teeth snapped down on the tip of Michael's ring finger. They were razor sharp, and they tore right through the bone to sever the fingertip off up to the back of the nail. Maggie yelled Michael's name as he cried out in pain. Blood poured out of the wound as he quickly covered it with part of his shirt. He tried to remember what to do when there was a loss of a piece of limb, but he was having a hard time thinking straight through the agony. And we're off, Bingo called out as his group got in the van. Be sure to come visit us tonight at the Carnival, or should I say, the newly rebranded Bingo's Circus Extravaganza. His laughter filled the air as the van pulled away.